I've always been told that there are two types of sermons that you will preach. There's the proverbial wedding sermon and the funeral sermon, right? Wedding sermons, you walk away happy, it's kind of maybe an uplifting tone. There's excitement or joy over what the future holds, or good news of release from, some broken thing or sin or, addiction or whatever the case is. And it's like, those are great, man. Those are super happy sermons. And then the funeral sermons, on the other hand, maybe not so much, right? You walk away, and I think the word a lot of people would probably describe as like conviction, which is like, it is a prompting to change the course and direction, your thoughts, your actions, whatever the case, but maybe like not in a happy way, right? There's like I'm excited to start a new workout routine, this week, and then there's like the me catching myself, like looking in the mirror, and I'm like, ooh, I need to start a new workout. Those two different types of like kind of thoughts about that I'm talking about. And it was funny because I had a conversation with someone this last week, and she was a mom, and she was like, man, it was Mother's Day. I was like really hoping that you would have something like exciting and uplifting last week, and I left feeling like really kind of bummed out. And so here's what I would say, man. Welcome to the prophetic books, right? Actually, it's going to be that way for probably the next 5 or 6 weeks, however long we're there. And, I don't know. It's like 6 more weeks of funeral sermons to go. But it doesn't mean they're bad or that they aren't good for our lives in some sort of way. But it just we're at like grief and suffering today. So, here we go. Y'all ready? That's where we're headed this morning. And the deal is the prophets didn't show up and speak when things were going well, man. It's kind of their job to show up when things were going off the rails and to speak truth to power. In fact, I told you guys a few things about like prophecy, trying to correct some ideas. One, that prophets weren't necessarily just like fortune tellers. I said it's not helpful to think of prophets as fortune tellers. Only about 30% of what they talked about was stuff that was like far out in the future, stuff that hadn't come to pass, or maybe even for us hasn't come to pass yet. The large majority of the stuff they talked about, 70% or more of what they talked about, was like speaking truth to the halls of power, the broken institutions. Yeah, I told you this. So the prophets were carrying a message from God to correct the broken social, political, and religious institutions. So if you're taking notes, that was kind of like their main thing. And I gave you guys the example of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. last week, right? He showed up at a time when segregation, something decidedly against God's plan for our world, was ruling supreme. And Dr. King showed up and spoke truth, justice, and righteousness to the halls of power in the broken social institutions that were perpetuating those systems of injustice, right? And not just that, man. He had words for churches. He had words for cities and things like that were actively participating in making this problem worse. And so I told you guys the primary purpose, like there was a reason why they did this. The primary purpose of the prophetic message was to get people to change their thoughts, their actions, their motivations, and thereby their relationship to God's impending judgment on those corrupt systems. Give you guys a bit of a thought experiment last week. Imagine someone, came in here and started, proclaiming, thus says, this is the word of the Lord. Next week, flight, American Airlines, 1695 is going to crash, leaving, I hope that's not a flight next week, right? But 1695 is going to crash, leaving the runway, and everyone on board is going to die. And I kind of gave you this thought experiment of like, can you change those events now that you know the future? And the really short philosophical and theological answer to that is actually no, you can't do anything about it. In fact, just the fact that you now know about this only solidifies all the more that this thing is going to come to pass, right? And if you try to like interfere, there's a good chance that you're going to be the one that causes it to happen, right? But what you can change is your relationship to those events, because actually, maybe some of you were planning on being on that flight next week, and now are you going to be on that flight? And the answer would be, no, I'm not going to be on that flight next week, right? And so you get the choice. Do you get to believe them about this future coming thing and change your relationship to it, or do you say these guys are crazy? And the problem is a lot of times they did crazy things like walked around the city naked or wore like camel's hair and stuff like that. And so a lot of people did kind of take them as crazy, but they were always right about what they were saying, right? Now, so we looked at the book of Isaiah last week, and this week I told you we were going to look at Jeremiah and Lamentations. And I actually told you we're going to spend the bulk of our time in Jeremiah, but I actually, as I got into some things, I switched the direction we were going to kind of go this morning, and we're going to spend most of our time in Lamentations, which is only 5 chapters, and so we'll get to see a good portion of that. But before we get into that, I want to introduce our subject this morning by playing a little game. So this is where you guys talk in church. You guys good with that? You have to help me today because I'm running on like half my cylinders misfiring. All right, so we're going to play a little game called Doctor. Anybody play Doctor with their kids? Usually ends up in, wearing a bunch of Band-Aids or something like that, right? And so I'm going to call out a symptom, an illness, or something like that, and then I want you guys to respond back with like how we fix this thing. You guys ready? We're going to start really simple. Here we go. And by the way, for all my military peeps out there, the answer to all these, 800 milligram, it's not, all right? So it's not 800 milligram ibuprofen or Motrin. So, yeah, extra water, hydrate, and take your ibuprofen, right? No, so it's not that, right? So just kind of give you guys a leg up. So let's start really simple. Paper cut. What do you do? Paper cut. There you go, Band-Aid disinfectant. Who said hand sanitizer? Who is sadistic, man? What is wrong with you? No. Neosporin and a Band-Aid, actually. So, yeah, I saw. There you go. All right, number 2, dehydration. Drink some water, right? Eat a banana. Is that part of it, too? Like some electrolytes or something? Yeah. All right, how about this one? Headache. Okay, so it's a bit of a trick question. That was maybe it on that one, right? So who's my Tylenol people? Raise your hand. Who's my Tylenol? Okay, put them down. Who's my Advil, like aspirin, that kind of people? Man, it's a very small crowd. Okay, well, interesting. Let's get a little harder, right? Let's get a little harder. You guys ready? Here's the next one. Military folks, you better be ready on this one. Malaria. How about that one? Jesse, what do they do for malaria, man? Go to the hospital. Yeah, go to the hospital. What's the medicine you take that gives you the crazy quinine? Doxy, that's the other one, right? Insane nightmares and some other incredible symptoms from that, but I won't say. Yeah, okay. Very good. How about this one? A little more serious. How about cancer? What about that? Radiation, chemotherapy, surgery. Anybody? Surgery? Yeah. Okay. And for our last one, you guys ready? You guys ready for it? How about grief? Therapy. That's good. I like that. Anything? Wait. I heard one right here. Time. Okay. So I wanted to zoom in. So I was just looking for that. I was kind of expecting that would be one of the ones that came up. So let me just. Why didn't we say time for any of the rest of them? It's me like you have a headache and enough time passes and you won't have a headache, right? Why not? Why not time? There's a quicker fix. There's actually something better out there for it. It's like actually kind of a bad solution, really. It's like same thing with paper cut. And it's like, yeah, time is really the thing that kind of heals the paper cut. I mean, Neosporin and a Band-Aid doesn't really do anything but keep it from getting infected or maybe getting worse. Time is really sort of the thing that heals all of those, and yet, like, we wouldn't say time for any of those others. And I actually put a lot of thought into maybe why that was this week. And I think it has to do with like maybe it being an inadequate coping mechanism. Honestly, just like it would be inadequate to say, for you to go to the doctor and him, tell you have cancer and say, all right, doc, what are we going to do about this? And you say, we're just going to give it time. It'll either be a problem or it won't, and Or I got this headache, and it's like, well, I got Tylenol here, but we could just give it time. Instead, it's like, no, sometimes it's actually a really inadequate coping mechanism, and I think we know that. So I got a thought experiment for you guys on this to maybe tease this idea out a little bit more. Let's just say that there was a pill that could get rid of grief like immediately. Right? So let's play this out. Tonight, you get home and your spouse or significant other, your kids are out in a vehicle and you expect them home and like the nightmare situation unfolds, right? Knock on the door and it isn't your wife and kids. There's 2 police officers and a doctor at the door. And they, say, sir, ma'am, regret to inform you, but your family was hit by a drunk driver and one or all of them have not made it through that, right? And actually, I think that's a nightmare scenario for a lot of us, right? Especially those whose kids are like approaching the age where they can begin to drive themselves around a little bit, right? And so the officer goes on to console you for a few moments after you receive this sort of crushing news. And then once you finally compose yourself and you kind of stand up, the officer, he steps aside and he introduces you to this doctor that's been standing there the whole time. And he leans forward and he says, hey, I want you to take this pill, and all of your grief will instantly go away. So that's just it. Actually, I'm so glad you asked that, because the answer is there aren't any side effects. And this isn't like some euphoric state where you're like above the grief, or this isn't something where it's like, no, you're just escaping this or something like that. It's like, no, actually, this is a miracle cure, and you go back to the like emotional state that you were prior to these events having happened. Right? Fully aware of them, and you just go back to the way that you were before these events would happen. So here's kind of the question. Would you take that pill if it existed? Raise your hand. Would you take the pill? No. I got one person that would take the pill. We probably should talk afterwards, man. No. So who in here wouldn't take the pill? Like, in all seriousness, who wouldn't take the pill? Who in here doesn't know why they would take the pill, other than some fuzzy inclination that it like doesn't seem right? Okay. Welcome to the real part of the thought experiment, and that is this question right here: is why? Why wouldn't we take the pill? And I've honestly tried, right? Like we could sit down, we could talk it out, and chances are I've thought through this part of the thought experiment. I've thought through philosophically, right? Is it like maybe we just need to somehow properly honor their memory, and maybe like solidarity with their pain and anguish is the only way to do that, right? And so like maybe that's why we wouldn't do it. Maybe it's a physical response. Maybe like our bodies just legitimately need time to regulate the chemical like sort of response to something so jarring to the system. And so maybe that wouldn't be a good thing. And so maybe it's our bodies know that that's not right. Perhaps it's something sociologically, right? We realize that it's just like that wouldn't be rational. It wouldn't be socially acceptable course of actions to do that, right? And yet, here's the deal. As I explored all of those out, actually, they're all unsatisfactory. Like they all come to a logical conclusion that you wouldn't be happy with once you arrived at that place. Why wouldn't we take the pill? And here's the deal, man. Like we wouldn't approach any other like malady or sickness or anything with this same sort of this same response. And yet, grief and suffering are the only two areas where a seeming non-answer is itself a viable answer. Even in the Bible, man, it's hard to tease out a reason like behind the why. Like, why must we endure grief and suffering? Well, there isn't necessarily like a reason for why we must endure it. I think there is an invitation for how we should process it well. It's for this reason that we're going to spend the bulk of our time in the book of Lamentations today. So I told you guys, super cheery stuff, right? Lamentations, grief, and suffering. But before we talk Lamentations, we have to put it in its proper context by understanding what's going on in Jeremiah. It's like peanut butter and jelly, right? They just sort of go together. Unless you're one of the psychopaths at my house that just eat a peanut butter sandwich. Anybody that does that, right? Oh my gosh, you just make me sick. All right. Anyways, we'll fly past and pretend that half y'all didn't raise your hands to that question, right? Let's start with the book of Jeremiah and let it kind of put in perspective this lament that we're going to read in the book of Lamentations. You guys ready for it? So Jeremiah, written by, drumroll please, a man named Jeremiah. He was a prophet and lived like right there in the transition period when the Babylonian exile came to be. So last week we talked Isaiah. Isaiah lived about 100 to 120 years before this. He watched the Assyrians come and take over the northern kingdom of Israel, right? And so they had worshipped other gods. They had done all kinds of crazy. They were killing their children in like worship to the god Molech. They were doing all these things. And God told them, man, through all these other prophets, that if you don't get right, I'm going to send somebody in. They're going to clean your house. And they did. The Assyrians came in and they like took them off into exile. And Judah, the southern kingdom, was watching all this happen. And so Isaiah was written primarily like, hey, look what happened up there. It's going to happen to you if you don't like straighten your act up, right? And so, and guess what? Do you think they straightened their act up? And the answer is actually no, they didn't. And so Jeremiah is coming 100 to 120 years later, like when the Babylonian exile is going to happen, right? And so Jeremiah is written to chronicle the impending fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians from God's perspective, right? This was a complex, like, geopolitical, like, big things happen. Empires rising and falling. The Assyrians were on the decline. The Egyptians were on the decline. The Babylonians were on the rise. But God is like, we get some of that stuff in 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. But really what's happening in the book of Jeremiah is we get God's perspective. Here's why this is happening from God's perspective, right? And so, this is meant to give those people a chance to change their relation to the impending judgment, right? Like, not you're going to be carried off into exile. Like, everybody is. Everybody's about to be carried off. You can be carried off as one of the ones that God is judging, or you can be carried off like with those same people, but knowing that God is doing this to maybe even rescue you from some of the broken things that are happening there in Jerusalem. In Judah, and there is hope, actually, for your situation. So there's two groups of people that are going out the door, and we're going to notice in the book of Jeremiah is several repeated themes from Isaiah, which is why we're going to spend most of our time in the book of Isaiah. A lot of the imagery and themes and language that Isaiah uses, like, they weren't sinning in new ways. They weren't like doing new things to like anger God over their situation. It was like they were still doing all of the same things. So you get a lot of repeated material, and so that's kind of why we're going to fly through and get into the book of Jeremiah. So this is important because it gives us the picture that the people did not heed Isaiah's warnings like 10 decades prior. It's wild because God actually said that was how it's going to work. You guys heard this before? This is Isaiah chapter 6, verse 8. He says, "Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, 'Whom shall I send, and whom will go for us?' And then I said, 'Here I am, send me.'" Anybody seen that on like a missions shirt or on like a coffee cup, man? It's like super encouraging and really awesome, right? And yet, everybody kind of pretty conveniently forgets like the very next verse in that line. And here's what it says. God says, "Okay, I will send you." And so he said, "Go and tell this people, keep on listening, but do not perceive. Keep on looking, but do not understand. Render the hearts of this people insensitive, their ears dull, and their eyes dim. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and return and be healed." Yeah, man, not so sure that needs to be like our mission trip logo, right? As we go out, it's like, yeah, keep on telling these people, but they're all going to like reject you, and they're all going to die because of that, right? And so Jeremiah is proof that Isaiah's mission worked exactly how God said it was going to work, right? So let's quickly knock out our story overview, and then we're gonna move into the book of Lamentations. So Jeremiah is broken. If you're taking notes, Jeremiah is broken into 5 distinct parts, stretching from before the exile to Babylon until the final day where God will judge all of the nations just as He has judged Israel. Section 1. Oh, wait just a second. For those of you guys taking notes. Section 1 spans chapters 1 through 24. Jeremiah sets up the metaphor of marital unfaithfulness as a picture of how Israel has treated her God. Jeremiah 3, 6 through 8. It's during the reign of King Josiah, the Lord said to me, "Hey, have you seen what faithless Israel has done? She has gone up on every hill and under every spreading tree and has committed adultery there. I thought that after she had done all this, she would return to me, but she did not. And her unfaithful sister, Judah, saw." This is who Jeremiah is talking to. He's talking to Judah. "I gave faithless Israel her certificate of divorce and sent her away because of all of her adulteries. Yet I saw that her unfaithful sister, Judah, had no fear. She also went out and committed adultery." Jeremiah is using the poetic image of an adulterous woman to describe how Israel had turned her back on God, His covenant. It was then like it was trying to rely on these other nations and gods for their provision. It's this incredibly powerful and moving image for what idolatry is actually like. And even though most of this section is pretty doom and gloom, there's a glimmer of hope in chapter 23. As with all the prophetic writing, there's an opportunity to turn, like if they will turn, and God promises to send His promised king from the line of David that will expand God's kingdom over all the earth. So that's section 1. Section 2 is chapters 25 through 29. Here it is. You guys ready? Judgment is coming. This is a little excerpt from that. Jeremiah 25, 8 through 9. "Therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, because you have not obeyed my words, behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, declares the Lord, and I will send them to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. my servant, and I will bring them against this land and against its inhabitants and against all these nations round about, and I will utterly destroy them and make them a horror and a hissing. I don't know what a hissing is, but it sounds terrible, right? And an everlasting desolation. But it's gone too far. Like, there is judgment coming. It's really interesting because we get this show-off between, like, kind of showdown between these two prophets. In chapter 28, we meet this prophet named Hananiah. And Hananiah is kind of like, no, man, God wouldn't do that. God is like a God of love. He wouldn't, he wouldn't, I know we've acted unfaithfully. I know we've did these things, but like God loves us and he won't, like, he's going to carry us off into exile. And Jeremiah's like, no, man, like even God's like patience, his long, it has limits and we've reached it. The Babylonians are coming and they're going to clean house when they get here. So, again, cheery stuff, man, funeral sermon. Section 3, chapters 30 through 33 are 4 chapters of consolation and hope where there will be an end to their suffering. So, yes, it is coming, and yes, God has a purpose in this, but it won't last forever. And there will be a day when you will come back into the land. This is Jeremiah 30, verse 3. It says, "For behold, days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will restore the fortunes of my people Israel and Judah. The Lord says, I will also bring them back to the land that I gave to their forefathers, and they shall possess it." A little further down, this is verse 11, same chapter, it says, "For I am with you, declares the Lord, to save you, for I will destroy completely all the nations where I have scattered you. Only I will not destroy you completely, but I will chasten you justly and will by no means leave you unpunished." Go ahead and underline that right there. Because I think we see in this a really good lesson about how God's discipline works. And I typically like to separate these two things out, like God's discipline and God's judgment, as though they were like two different things, aimed at two different people. And I think that is a helpful category in which to think about this, but it doesn't always work out so neat and tidy in the Bible. Sometimes that language is really intermixed together, right? And so I want to talk about discipline and judgment for a second, because I think it's something that has kind of earned God a bit of a bad name. I don't know how else to say it, but that God maybe either unfairly disciplines people, or that for some reason he disciplines people and we don't know why. Like maybe things are just going sideways in our life, and maybe you have people much like Job's friends that are standing around you saying, well, you must have done something wrong. Like God is disciplining. God is judging you for what you've done, right? And I actually think that's a very unhelpful way to think about God's judgment and God's discipline. You see, God's discipline always has a purpose of which we will be aware. When we think of God as like a good father, like who in here would like come into their kid's bedroom and like a week after some event happened and just like give them a spanking or ground them, or however you just like really come down really hard on their kids and be like, and that'll teach you, and walk out? Like, who would do that? And they would be, that'll teach me what, right? Like what did that actually just accomplish? Like why would you do that? Why? Like, what are you trying to correct in me? Like, that doesn't make any sense at all. And yet, for some reason, we tend to think that God will do that with us. That like, okay, things are going south. It must be God trying to like punish me for something, and I need to like maybe figure out why. And it's like, let me tell you, it doesn't work that way. I mean, this should correct maybe some really messed up and kind of squirrely ideas about God's judgment and God's justice. It doesn't work that way. For those people who like love God, who've like followed after Jesus, man, like he doesn't discipline his people just out of nowhere. Yeah, man, he does. And sometimes it's painful discipline, sometimes it's difficult things that happen. But here's the deal, man, you'll know. Like, and how that works out is something that we actually worked that out a little bit in our expedition group a few weeks ago. And I think that's something that you just have to work out in relationship with other people. Section 4. Moving right along, Section 4 covers chapters 34 and 44. It is a narrative retelling of the events of the Babylonian takeover. A lot of this material is pulled out of like 1st and 2nd Kings, 2nd Chronicles and stuff. The prophets wrote a lot of times in this like thick metaphor, poetic, very like image, heavy material. And this is sort of like acting as like a key to a map. And it's like, yeah, I know he said that like, the gates are going to burn and this is going to happen, and it's just, really poetic imagery. But then he goes on to explain like in narrative detail what it looked like. And it sort of gives us like, here's actually how this is going to work out in real life. And then the book closes with chapters 45 and 52 through 52. And it gives us this cosmic view of God's judgment and how it will one day be extended to all the nations. Jeremiah chapter 50, verses 2 through 5. He says, declare and proclaim among the nations. Proclaim it and lift up a standard. Do not conceal it, but say, Babylon has been captured. Bel has been put to shame. Marduk has been shattered. Her images have been put to shame. Her idols have been shattered. For a nation has come up against her out of the north. It will make her land an object of horror, and there will be no inhabitant in it. This is the exact same language that he used to describe what was about to happen to Israel, right? Or Judah. And he says, in those days and at that time declares the Lord, the sons of Israel come, both they and the sons of Judah as well. They will go along weeping as they go, and it will be the Lord their God they will seek. They will ask for the way to Zion, turning their faces in its direction. They will come that they may join themselves to the Lord in an everlasting covenant that will not be forgotten. So think about this. You're an Israelite. You've been carried off into Babylon. And you get there, and you see a lot of the same exact things. It's like, man, they're worshiping the same gods we were there in Israel. It's Bel, it's Marduk, it's Molech. They're sacrificing their children. They're doing some crazy things in the temples. That's the very things that the prophets spoke out against us, and yet they're the ones that have just captured us. And God's sort of saying, like, hey, man, like, they're going to get theirs one day, right? Like, I haven't forgotten this. I haven't overlooked this. Like my judgment is good. It is true. It is definitely just. And I'm going to deal with them, right? And so the final theme of the book is honestly one of hope, despite the radical upheaval of everything they had just experienced, right? Okay, book of Jeremiah. Everybody, like, take a deep breath. Whew. Okay, everybody good? We good? Oh, we got through that. I know it was a little preachy there, like pun intended. One of the longest books in the Bible. It is actually the longest book in the Old Testament, if you consider the fact that Psalms and some of these other books were broken down into like 3 and 4 books. It's the longest single continuous scroll in the Old Testament. A lot of theology, a lot of stuff happening, a lot that's repeated from other places. But it's heavy, heavy stuff, man. Watching an entire people group sort of get taken over and run off into exile. And out of that, we're about to see some emotions crop up of watching that whole thing go down. And that's what the book of Lamentations is trying to get at, right? So Lamentations was written by the same guy, Jeremiah. And yet, when you read its 5 short chapters, it sounds nothing like the book that you just read. Lamentations stands unique amongst the writings of the other prophets in that it isn't declaring some future event. It's not claiming to possess God's perspective on the current events either. It's not like God talking to his people. This isn't God speaking to his people at all, actually. This is the people and the prophets speaking back to God. And so what are they talking to God about? I'm so glad you asked because I was ready to answer that question, right? Who in here is old enough to remember like 9/11, where you were when all that was going down? Okay, so this will land on just about everybody here. Yeah, I was in like 7th, 8th grade, I think. I can still remember watching it on live TV. Did you guys have live TV there? You watched it every day? Yeah, and so like right at lunchtime, we would watch like this live TV broadcast there in our classrooms, and it just so happened that like it went live early, and then like it stayed on, and we watched it there. And that was wild, man. For 7th grade, that was incredibly wild. I can still remember going out and jumping on my trampoline in the weeks after that, and being like, this is how crazy it was that there wasn't any air traffic. Y'all remember that little season right afterwards? Where it was like there was nothing in the skies for like weeks after that. I still remember getting let out early from school as if the terrorists were going to come to Batesville, Arkansas, right? And I remember the ride home where I was processing some really confusing, like, emotions, like maybe a little bit of fear. I mean, I knew that it was some far-off thing in one sense, but I knew this was different really than anything else I'd ever experienced, any other news or anything like that I'd ever seen. I'll never forget a conversation I had with my mom. To this day, it's still kind of like makes the hair stand up on the back of my neck. She said, "Man, we were stopped in front of Walmart heading out of town at a stoplight," and I was like, "Man, why is this such a big deal? You know, like, I mean, why are we getting let out of school early for this? Like, what's?" And very quietly, she said to me, "This won't be the end of the lives lost because of this." She's like, "You know, we're going to war over this." And y'all, I mean, to this day, like that still haunts me, kind of. The problem with this example, however, is that like all examples, you press it far enough and it begins to break down. Because this isn't really what happened to Jerusalem and Babylon and all that, right? In order for it to be kind of like that, let's take this example a little further. In order for it to be like what happened to the Babylonians, the terrorists did have to show up at Batesville, Arkansas. And then they would have had to have forced us watch them as they blew up the White House and the nation's Capitol building. And then marched, George Bush out on the front lawn naked and gouged out his eyes and shackled him in chains and then put him on an aircraft and flew him over. And then for it to be like that, they would have then had to have turned to us and been like, and you're next. And could you imagine some foreign occupying, people that we viewed as terrorists, just coming in and they win? I can't really imagine it. Closest I can come is going back to 9/11 and trying to stretch out those events a little bit in my mind. And it isn't just the radical upending of maybe the safety. Maybe somebody breaks into your home, and it was safe. It was the place that you thought, this is impenetrable. This is our safe. And all of a sudden now it's not that anymore. Maybe I can imagine a little bit of that, but I really have a hard time imagining just how brutal and just how difficult this was. I mean, the symbol of their national identity was destroyed. They're marching off, watching them rip the walls that signified their nation's autonomy and ability to rule itself and to keep itself and its citizens safe. And they're just watching it being ripped down in front of them. Can you imagine the fear, the anger, the confusion, the where are you at, God, right? Can you imagine the emotions that you would be feeling in this moment? I'm still shook from the end of Avengers, right? The bad guy won, you guys remember that? Bad guy wins, and I had to wait a year before I got some resolution to that, and it shook me hard. And for those of you who went on that journey, too, right? Wrecked me. Can you imagine though, knowing if that had been it, and it was all right, well, and that's it, the end of the Avengers, or could you imagine knowing that you may never return back from this? In fact, God has told most of you that you're going to die. You're going to die in some far off country that is very hostile to you. You're not even allowed to speak your own language in public. And so Lamentations is the collective emotions of Jeremiah and the people as they are being drug off into Babylon, looking over their shoulders as their temple, their homes, their businesses, the walls that signified their autonomy and safety, is all burning, being torn down. And they're processing through the emotions of this. And some Babylonian guard is cracking the whip over their back and screaming and cussing at them as they walk down the road. Lamentations is processing all of that grief and suffering. So let's just divert for just a second, because we've actually covered this topic of lamenting. And it's not something that we do in our culture, but it's something that you see all over the Bible. And we talked about it back in the book of Psalms, because we actually get a bunch of laments in the Psalms. So I want to redefine lamenting for you. If you're taking notes, lament is the prayer language for God's people as they live in a world marred by sin. And it's how we talk to God about our sorrows as we renew our hope in His sovereign care. So I want to quickly remind you that there were two groups of people. Because if we only take Jeremiah in view, it may seem like this is only talking to people who've sort of brought sorrow on themselves. And there was definitely that group of people in the procession that day. There were people that had actively participated in the idolatry, that had actively participated in the systems of injustice, and God was absolutely coming to bring the hammer down on this group of people. See, they're being carried off. And it's addressing that sorrow. And so here's the question, is have you ever found yourself in grief and sorrow at the hands of your own making? You ever been there before? I mean, you don't have to raise your hand to that, right? Absolutely. But there's another group of people as well. We're going to meet a few of them in a couple of weeks. We meet Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. 4 young friends, man, that were carried off into exile. Actually, they were incredibly faithful to their God. They cared about justice. They cared about doing what was right, seeking the welfare of the people in their city and the foreigner, the widow, the orphan, right? They're in that crowd too, getting carried off. And I think that's some of us as well, because I think there are these moments where things happen in our life and it's just as a matter of course in the fact that we live in a broken and jacked up world. It's really hard to discern maybe who's at fault, or even if there's anyone at fault, if it's just how life goes sometimes. Again, this is us too, right? Just know that Lamentations is processing the grief and suffering of both of these groups of people. So wherever you may find yourself at in here this morning, this is talking to you. So let's see how it does that in our story overview. Chapters 1 through 4 make up section 1 and are a collection of poems forming an acrostic. You know what an acrostic is? It's a first letter of, every stanza actually is how this works. Every new verse in the original Hebrew starts with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And you don't really get that in your English versions, but some of you, I think ESV does a pretty good job of laying out the different segments of that. And the idea here is that Jeremiah is giving a very organized and intelligent, objective view of their suffering. For 4 chapters, he's trying to take the uncategorical, and organize the chaos of grief into a thoughtful, poetic lament. It's like he's laying out all of their problems, their fears, their anger, their confusion, and he's stating them A to Z, right? It's very dense, it's very well thought out, like Hebrew poetry, lamenting poetry. And I think what we're seeing here is, I think we're seeing an invitation to name our pain and explore the grimy depths and how it has affected every area of our heart and soul. We have a problem with this in our culture. In fact, we go to extreme lengths to distract ourselves from this very thing. It's amazing to me. I was having a conversation with somebody this week. It's amazing to me how we have been able to distract ourselves from the subject of death even. 150 years ago, if Mamaw died, we were digging the hole, right? And we were going to keep her somewhere until we buried, and it was our job to do that. But now, as with a lot of things, we've sort of segmented this off to this thing that we don't have to see or touch or think about. And so, man, we go long stretches of our life without ever if we're successful, we don't have to think about these deep existential things. And yet real lamenting is asking us to turn off the music, turn off Netflix, right? Whatever the case, whatever that thing is that we use, that we don't want to be alone with our own thoughts and our own emotions as we process through those. Lament is saying, no, turn it off, set in the quiet, and organize, categorize what may seem uncategorical at the time. I said this, more than a sinful rehearsing of our anger, or maybe pain or grief or suffering, biblical lament humbly and honestly identifies the pain, questions, and frustrations raging in our souls. We'll do anything to numb the pain. We'll do anything to not look in the dark recesses of our soul. We shy away from the existential at every turn. And yet, Jeremiah is inviting us to not just explore the depths of our grief and its associated emotions. He's inviting us to find the very bottom of it. That's what we see, man. He goes deeper and deeper and deeper. With every new letter, they move deeper down in the alphabet, and they move into deeper and deeper emotions and things that drive the way that we think about ourselves and the world. And the reason is because at the bottom, where else do you have to go but up, right? Listen to this. This is Lamentations 3:18. This is, so I say, my strength has perished. I'm done, right? And so has my hope from the Lord. Well, that's rock bottom, right? Where can you go from rock bottom? Well, I think you go here. This is the next verses. This is verse 19 and 23. Remember my affliction and my wandering, the wormwood and bitterness. Surely my soul remembers and is bowed down within me. This I recall to my mind. Therefore, I have hope. The Lord's loving kindness indeed never ceases, for His compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Some of those coffee cup, verses that we like to toss out there. But the reality is that realization is made from the very bottom of brokenness and despair as they are watching their lives and everything they hold dear crumble before them. And it's as we find the depths of this, man, our eyes only have one direction to go. Lament always comes from despair, but is classified as lament because it also has hope. If you're taking notes. So that's section 1. Everybody doing good? This is the air went out of the room, man. So it's all good. Everybody take a breath. We'll get through this. Section 2 is comprised of chapter 5 and has no discernible rhyme or poetic movement. But rhyme and poetic movement are what give poetry its meaning, right? It's the rhyme scheme. It's the maybe the word that drives sort of the movement of the poem forward that gives it its meaning. And it has none of that. And if you read it in English, they're going to try to connect some dots for you, but just know that's the translators trying to give you a leg up, because in the original Hebrew, man, the acrostic, it goes away. It is absolute chaos. It's like all heck has just broken loose, and the author has just completely given in to the emotions associated with his grief. And I guess here's the question. Have you ever been there? Have you ever experienced pain so deep that you couldn't define your thoughts through logic or reason? I believe the biblical term is just wailing. This is literally just the cry out to God. God, I just need somebody. I can't even form my thoughts. Laying, sobbing into your pillow, maybe just uncontrollable grief and emotional outburst. Here's what I think we should take away from this, man. I think we're invited into a space where it is safe to process our emotions through letting them out. Please understand, this doesn't mean just letting them out on other people, because we're oftentimes inclined to do that. We're invited to let them out to God. He's big enough. He can handle our criticisms, our doubts, our frustrations, our anger, our fears. And this would be pretty radical news for some of you guys, because I didn't grow up knowing that you could talk to God that way. I don't know about any of you guys, but there was always sort of a reverence to how we approach God. And it isn't that you're being necessarily irreverent in this, but just brutally honest in raw emotional form. You are bringing the depths of your brokenness, your emotions, your feelings, your thoughts. God, where are you? And you see it. Chapter 5, it just breaks down, man. It's raw emotion. There's no real redeeming until you get to the very end, which we're going to cover next. But there's no hope. It doesn't seem to be a bottom of it, and he just keeps on plummeting. Have you ever been there? I've been there. And what Lamentations is doing is it is inviting us to turn that conversation Godward, because God can handle it. Notice, though, how much attention is actually allotted to this in the book of Lamentations. 4 chapters categorizing, logic, thinking through, giving voice to in very kind of sequential steps. And then 1 chapter out of 5, so 20% of the book is this sort of raw emotional outbreak. Again, man, I think we should check how we respond. I think it's good and right and biblical to respond this way. I think we should be measured in how much we let our emotions take control. But I want to take our deeper dive, and this is where we're going to spend kind of our last few minutes here, in the last 4 verses of the book. And this is going to be incredibly frustrating to some of you guys. But here we are. We're going to read them together, and then we'll close out. Lamentations 5:19 through 22. Here's what it says. You, O Lord, rule forever. Your throne is from generation to generation. This is the only positive statement in the entire 5th chapter of Lamentations, right? Then he goes right back, next verse. Why do you forget us forever? Why do you forsake us so long? Restore us to you, O Lord, that we may be restored. Renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and are exceedingly angry with us. And the book ends, actually. And here's the deal. If you could read Hebrew, it's even more frustrating than that. So if you have a pen or whatever you write in your Bible, I want you to go ahead and add 2 more dots next to that final period there at the end of the book, chapter 22. Here's the problem with our modern translations is that they don't like to incorporate incomplete sentences and incomplete thoughts into the Bible, right? So they add a direct object or they add like a verb in there, some verbal agreement that will like close out the sentence nice and neat. But if you read it in the Hebrew, it's like it's not there. It's like saying, restore us to you, O Lord, unless you're still angry, in which case... ... right? And it just sort of ends in this incomplete like cliffhanger to the end of the book. And this is it, right? Remember when I told you that grief and suffering are like the only things where a non-answer is in itself an answer? This is that moment in the grief process where there doesn't seem to be an end in sight. It's that point where you realize things may never be the way that they were before. You may never seemingly be whole again after fill in the blank. And yet, I want us to dive into the 2 sentences that fall right before that. We see 2 views. And I think we're inclined to see these as like diametrically opposing views, things that are at odds with one another. Here they were, in case you forgot. You, O Lord, rule forever. Your throne is from generation to generation. That could fit in any like positive, exciting wedding sermon, right? But here it is, right in the middle of a funeral sermon, right? That's to say, your throne, symbol of God's power and capability, is forever reaching. God, you are sovereign and good, and nothing is out of your control. You know, this is a moment in the story or in the sermon where I would really, really, really love to stop and just sort of camp out here and tell you that like, oh, there's hope on the other side of this grief. There's hope on the other side of this suffering. Like, God is good. He's bigger than this. He has a plan for this. And absolutely, all of that is absolutely true. And yet, why do you forget us forever? Why do you forsake us so long? See the very next sentence. Are you kidding me, right? You've forgotten me. So yes, maybe that's true on one hand. Maybe you are good. Maybe there is hope to be found in you. Maybe you can bring healing. But like maybe you just don't care. Maybe you've forgotten me. Maybe you're powerless to do anything about it. We hold that one in the other. So these are 2 things. One in each hand. We endure that through the ... That's how Lamentations ends. You got one of these in one hand. It's God, you're good. There's hope to be found in you, right? There's healing, right? You're the only one. Your throne endures forever. And then on the other hand, dude, this is the raw emotional. This is how I feel. Is my emotions tied to this thing? Like, I'm angry at you. Where are you? I feel like this is your fault, or I feel like, maybe this is my fault, and you're just not telling me that. Whatever the case is, and you've got both of these in your hand, and it ends ... How in the world does that provide comfort in the middle of grief? Let's go back to our playing doctor example that we started with. I think it's a lot like chemo. If you've ever been with someone or known someone that's gone through chemo, you know how absolutely destructive it is, right? Yeah, it's medicine, but it's literally killing you and just hoping that it kills the cancer before it kills you. I mean, you realize that's sort of how chemo sort of works, right? If you've been around chemo patients, there's good days, there's bad days, right? There's days where they feel like fighting, holding on, making it through, and there's days where they don't. Sure, the cancer is technically dying, and you are technically getting better, but the improvements are so negligible in light of the overwhelming sickness you're living in every single waking moment that it's hard to see that. Then one day, things begin to change. Slowly but surely, it's working, right? The chemo, man, if it does its job and it's like it wins the day. The reality is that your mind, your body, right, will forever bear the scars of that deadly cure. But as you know, chemo patients don't define themselves by the scars. They define themselves by their wellness, right? How long for Lily? This week, right? How long is it? 5 years. 5 years, Lily. That's how we define ourselves, right? Grief and lament work very much in the same way. And again, this is the part of the sermon where I want to go somewhere happy and be like, well, this is, God, there is hope and it's going to be great. But I'm not going to. I'm actually going to commit the mortal sin of public speaking. And I'm going to let you walk out of here with a drastically unresolved tension. It's like holding on to two junkyard dogs, right? You got a big log chain with a 180-pound pit bull on each side of you, right? And on one side of you, you have this realization that God is good, that God does see you, that God knows you, God is capable. God may even have a reason in this and can like make you come out of the side, refine you out the back side of this thing to be something even more precious than you were before you went into this. Right? That's good. That's where I want to end the sermon, right? But, oh God, why have you forsaken us? How long are you going to forget us? You have that on the other hand. In the process is in the ... You're wrestling with both these things. And the question is, why would I leave you like this? As your pastor, I sat down with many of you throughout the week, text message, phone calls, and I processed through this stuff with you. And what I know to be true is that there is nothing that I can say in that moment that will come out as anything more than a religious platitude if I try to just give you the hope. Right? Maybe it isn't you, right? And maybe not. And if it's not, then look to your left and look to your right, and it's one of them. And if you've been alive long enough, then what you know is that if it isn't you now, it will be in the future. And so I'm not really interested in closing out with something that's going to come off as a bit of a platitude. It's not neat and tidy. And the grief and healing process that leads to this isn't something that it isn't a neat. It's you're fighting two junkyard dogs. You're holding on to something. And it's and if the tension eases up all at once on one of them, be careful. It's probably coming to bite you in the ankle. And if you feel a little uneasy in this tension as you walk out of here, just know that you've probably actually grasped the book of the Bible that deals in grief and suffering and yet ends in a ... So what do I say, man? I guess here would be it. It's don't quit fighting. Is that right, Lily? Don't quit. Don't you yank that chain back, right? There are going to be days you need to wrap that thing around your arm and you need to hold it close. There are going to be days where one of them wants to get away from you and one where it looks like the other dog has just laid down and died, but it doesn't work that way. Hang on. And wrestle in the ... because the reality is, this is close to a good, happy feeling you're going to get, right? The reality is that one of those dogs is stronger, more powerful and capable than the other. Get involved in some community with people who want to walk along beside you and help you grab hold of those chains and pull them in, right? That's what we talked about last week. It's messy. It's gut-wrenching honesty. It's walking along. It's not sexy. It's not quick. It's not easy. Dude, it's raw, emotional, like walking alongside people as they find the depths of their emotional, like brokenness and pain and hurt and frustration and anger at God. Like reminding them that these things are absolutely true with God, but we're here with you to walk in the middle. That's what this community is supposed to be. Dude, church ain't a place you show up to on Sunday morning, man. That's church. So I don't know, man. I don't know where you walked in here at. I know that if it isn't you, it will be. Again, funeral sermon. Sorry. Like, it is. If you live long enough, it will be you. And when that comes, you need to know this. Like that this is the process. This is the invitation from the Bible, is to openly explore and lay these things in front of God, not in hopelessness, and absolutely like for the purpose of putting your eyes on God, that He is the one like our hope is in throughout all this. But like the process is like wrestling these two junkyard dogs in the middle of the ... So yeah, told you guys, man, funeral sermon. You guys doing good? It's Lamentations. So I think there's a lot of places that you can land in this. I think for a lot of you guys, man, it's you've been wrestling. You've been there for a while. Maybe you know this. Maybe you've been following Jesus for a long time, and you know a lot of this stuff. And so maybe what you need is you need to pull up alongside some people, some community here, people that want to be good family and help you wrestle those two chains. We have expedition groups that help you do that. Groups where we meet together in smaller numbers. We can be open. Nobody wants to be open about their marital issues or the grief or the suffering that they're going through in this setting right here, right? And so this is a place of intimacy and safety where we come together and work through some of these things. Maybe you just need to see the hope that's in Jesus for the very first time. Maybe you got one handhold on one dog, and it is your frustration, it's your grief, your pain, and your suffering. Man, let me give you some good news, man. There's something else out there that will keep you from getting dragged in one direction. So maybe you need to have a conversation with somebody about what following after Jesus would look like for the very first time. If that's you, man, I'm going to be hanging out in the back. Would love to have that conversation. Again, I don't know where you're at, but that's Lamentations. Good stuff, guys. Probably one of the most overlooked books, just as a side note, maybe on a happier note, right? It's so overlooked, in fact, that when I finished planning this, I had 65 books of the Bible down, and I was like, what in the heck am I missing, right? It's like, so I will shamefully admit that it was Lamentations. And so I went back and had to rework my entire year-long schedule to accommodate this in there. So anyways, let's close in prayer, guys. God, we love you. Thank you for the hope that you give us. Thank you for the truth and the goodness of your concern for us. Our problems are not foreign to you. You know us. You love us deeply. God, I pray that we would be the type of community that can love people in the middle of this process. It takes work on both sides. It takes people being willing to involve themselves in the community and open themselves to it, but it takes us being the type of people that would make people comfortable with doing that, God. And I pray that you would work that into both of our hearts on both sides of this issue. I just pray for the people that are right in the middle of a fight, maybe just even for their very lives right now, God. Grief, suffering, pain beyond imagining. Pray that they wouldn't give up the fight. They wouldn't forget that there's hope in you. God, I just thank you for how you've given us hope through your Son. I just pray that we would be a people who would constantly be reorienting our lives back underneath that hope. We love you and we praise you. And all this we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.